There is a woman sitting alone at a corner table in a restaurant in Atlanta, Georgia. She is dressed simply. No jewelry, no display, nothing about her that announces what she is worth. She is 61 years old. She has a plate of half-eaten salmon in front of her, a glass of lemon water she has barely touched, and the particular kind of stillness that belongs to people who have learned how to carry enormous things without letting anyone see the weight. She is not reading her phone. She is not scanning the room for recognition. She is just sitting there, quietly, in the way that a person sits when they are not really present in the room they are physically occupying, when the real conversation they are having is happening entirely inside themselves, with someone who is no longer alive to answer back. Nobody in that restaurant knows who she is. The couple near the bar does not know. The two women finishing dessert by the window do not know. The young waiter making his way toward her table at 9:47 on a Tuesday night in March does not know. He is 24 years old. His name is Marcus Webb. He has been on his feet for 11 hours. He is carrying something too, not the invisible kind, not the internal kind, but the concrete, daily, grinding weight of a life that is held together by discipline and love and very little margin for error. He approaches the table. He picks up her plate. He starts to turn, and then he stops. And what he does next, what he says in the next 30 seconds, sets in motion a chain of events so unlikely, so layered, so full of connections that neither of them knew existed, that by the time you reach the end of this story, you will not be thinking about Marcus or Diane at all. You will be thinking about your own life. You will be thinking about the people who went without so you could have more. And you will be asking yourself whether you are doing enough with what they gave you. Stay with me, because this story is about to go somewhere you are not expecting. And the first 10 seconds you just heard, that woman, that table, that Tuesday night, those are not the beginning of this story. They are the middle. To understand what really happened in that restaurant and why it matters the way it matters, we have to go back. We have to go back to Southwest Atlanta. We have to go back to Macon, Georgia. We have to go back to two grandmothers who never met each other, who lived 2 blocks apart, who made the same quiet sacrifice in the same quiet way, and whose love, decades later, would find each other across a restaurant table in the most ordinary and the most extraordinary way that love ever finds anything, through a question about leftovers. 3 questions are going to drive everything you are about to see, and if you can, stay with me long enough to find the answers to all 3 of them, I promise you that something will shift in how you understand the word grace. The first question is this: why would a woman who owns billions of dollars be eating alone at a mid-range restaurant in Midtown Atlanta on a Tuesday night? She is not trying to stay anonymous in a therapeutic way. She is not running from her money or trying to prove something about herself. She has a personal rule that has been with her since her first $1 million, and that rule is this: eat where regular people eat. Never let comfort become a wall between you and the world you came from. Never forget that the distance between your present and your past is shorter than it looks. And that brings us to the second question: what was so important about those leftovers that a young man making minimum wage plus tips would risk his job, would overcome every instinct toward dignity and self-protection, and would ask a stranger for their food? The answer is not what you think it is. It is not hunger, in the ordinary sense. It is not desperation in the way that word usually gets used. It is something much deeper than that. And the third question, the one that will stay with you long after you finish watching, is this: when that woman found out the real reason he was asking, when she understood what was actually behind that simple question about salmon and roasted vegetables, why did she start crying in front of that entire restaurant? What could possibly connect a waiter and a billionaire so deeply, so suddenly, that a question about leftovers could unlock something in her that she had been protecting for decades? The answer goes back further than either of them realized. It goes back to Southwest Atlanta. It goes back to Macon, Georgia. It goes back to 2 women who never met, who both understood something about sacrifice that nobody ever talks about until it is too late to thank them for it. Marcus Webb was born in Southwest Atlanta, Georgia, in a neighborhood that the city had stopped investing in approximately 20 years before Marcus arrived. This was not a neighborhood that fell apart suddenly. It was a neighborhood that the market simply decided to stop protecting, the way the market does when it decides that the people living there are not profitable to serve. Marcus's parents were young when he was born. His father was not regularly present. His mother worked 2 jobs, one at a hospital, one at a restaurant, and she did this because she understood something about the mathematics of survival that poor people have to learn whether they want to or not. One job did not cover it. 2 jobs sometimes barely covered it. But 2 jobs meant there was a chance. There was the possibility of something beyond the immediate crisis. And then his mother got sick. Not the kind of sick that announces itself as an emergency, not at first. The slow kind that accumulates, that steals energy first and health second, that you can hide for a while until you cannot hide it anymore. Marcus was 6 years old when his mother died. He does not remember her face clearly, and this fact has haunted him in ways that most people who still have their parents cannot fully understand. He remembers her voice. He remembers her hands. He remembers the exact way she said his name when she was proud of him. But the actual architecture of her face has faded into the way memory does when you are too young to hold on to something permanent. After she died, Marcus went to live with his grandmother. Her name was Ruby Webb. She was in her early 50s at the time, and she had already been working for nearly 40 years in jobs that did not pay her enough to live on, but that she had kept because they were honest work and because honest work was what she understood. Ruby Webb had raised 4 children of her own. She had done this while working as a custodian in schools and hospitals, while raising a disabled sister, while maintaining a house and a yard and a presence in her church. By the time Marcus came to live with her, she was tired in a way that goes deeper than physical tiredness. She was tired in the way that you get tired when you have been responsible for other people's survival for 40 years and you have not yet finished. And then she took on one more responsibility. She took on Marcus. And she did this not with the energy of a person who had reserves left, but with the particular ferocity of a woman who understood that this child had already lost one person, and that she would die before she let him lose another. Ruby rearranged her entire life to accommodate Marcus. She worked her full-time job and then picked him up from school and helped him with homework and made sure there was food and structure and the particular kind of unconditional presence that only grandmothers seem to have the capacity to give. She did not have money. She did not have time. She did not have energy. What she had was determination and love, and the understanding that both of those things could be converted through sheer will into a future for this child that looked different from his beginning. Marcus was an excellent student. His teachers used to tell Ruby this at parent-teacher conferences, and Ruby would listen with the kind of pride that only comes from knowing exactly how much sacrifice went into every grade. Marcus was sharp in a way that you could not fake. He could think around corners. He could see problems from angles that other people had not considered. He was not the loudest person in his classes. He was not the most popular. But by the time he reached high school, he was the person that other students asked for help when they needed to understand something real. He was the person that teachers noticed and kept their eyes on. He was the person whose trajectory seemed to point towards somewhere beyond Southwest Atlanta, and in a neighborhood where that was not always possible, where the market and the systems had decided that most young people would not go very far. Marcus Webb seemed like he might be an exception. He graduated from high school in the top 10% of his class. He earned a full academic scholarship to Georgia State University. And when he left for his first semester, Ruby stood on the porch of that house in Southwest Atlanta where she had poured everything into keeping him safe and fed and loved, and she cried tears that she had been accumulating for years. Not sad tears, but the kind that only come when something you sacrificed for finally starts to become real. She had given him the chance. Now it was his job to take it. Marcus's first year at Georgia State University was everything that he and Ruby had hoped it would be and more. He was studying business administration. He was getting strong grades. He was working part-time at a coffee shop near campus to cover the gap between his scholarship and his actual expenses. He called Ruby every Sunday without fail. He told her about his professors, Professor Williams, who was brilliant but harsh, Professor Chun, who believed in him in a way that made him feel capable of more than he had thought he could do. He told her about his classmates, about the ideas that were starting to take shape in his head, about what kind of life he wanted to build, what kind of difference he wanted to make. And Ruby would listen to every single word, sitting in her kitchen in Southwest Atlanta, and she would say the same thing at the end of every call. She would say, "Baby, you are doing exactly what you were supposed to be doing. I am so proud of you." And Marcus believed her completely. For the first time in his life, everything felt like it was moving in the right direction, like the sacrifice had been worth it, like the future was actually going to open up into something real. Then the second year began, and things started to shift in ways that Marcus had not planned for and could not control. Ruby's health began to decline slowly at first, and then with accelerating speed in the way that these things often do. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that put her in immediate danger, but enough to mean that her fixed income, the pension from her custodian work, the small social security she had started to draw, was no longer stretching the way it used to. Her medication costs went up. The house needed a repair that could not wait. Property taxes increased. The mathematics of survival, which had been difficult when Ruby was young and strong, became impossible when Ruby was 65 and tired and dealing with the wear that decades of physical labor had put on her body. And Ruby, being Ruby, said nothing about any of this to Marcus for months. She protected him from the truth the way grandmothers have protected grandchildren. From the truth since the beginning of time, not out of deception, but out of love. So deep it becomes its own kind of selflessness. She continued to answer his Sunday calls with the same warmth, the same encouragement, the same steady voice. That had been his foundation since he was 6 years old. She did not mention the medication she had skipped. She did not mention the grocery shopping she had cut back on. She did not mention the nights she lay awake thinking about how she was going to keep the house, keep Marcus in school, keep herself alive. She just protected him. She just loved him. And she waited. Marcus found out the truth not from Ruby but from his aunt, who called him one October afternoon during his sophomore year and told him gently but directly that Ruby had been skipping meals to keep the bills paid. Not every day, not dramatically, just quietly, the way proud women of a certain generation do. Quietly going without lunch so that someone else does not have to worry. When Marcus heard those words, something shifted in him permanently. It was not a small shift. It was a fundamental reorganization of what he understood his life to be about. He was supposed to be in school. He was supposed to be the one moving forward, building on the foundation that Ruby had sacrificed to create. But that foundation was cracking, and the only person who could hold it was him. He made a decision that same afternoon. He withdrew from Georgia State University at the start of his second semester. He came back to Southwest Atlanta. He got a full-time job. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he would go back. And he meant it with everything he had. He just did not know yet how long temporary was going to last. By the time Marcus Webb was 24 years old and working at a mid-range restaurant in Midtown Atlanta, Diane Carter had already lived a life that would have been remarkable even if everything that happened after had never occurred. Diane was born in Macon, Georgia, in 1962, the third of 5 children, in a household where money was not simply tight. Money was a stranger that passed through occasionally and never stayed long enough to be useful. This was not a household where people complained about their circumstances. This was a household where people understood that complaining was a luxury that other families had access to, and this family did not. Diane's father worked at a textile mill in Macon. He worked a full shift every weekday and often picked up additional hours on weekends. He was not an ambitious man in the way that the word gets used by people who have had options. He was a reliable man. He was a man who showed up and did his work and came home and asked about his children's days. Diane's mother cleaned houses. She cleaned houses in the morning before her children left for school, and she cleaned houses in the afternoon after her children came home from school, and on weekends, she cleaned houses while her children played in the yard or did their homework. She did this because the mathematics were simple. 1. Income was not enough, and she had made a decision that she was not going to ask her husband to work more hours than he was already working. If more money was needed, she would be the one to find it. What this meant, in practical terms, was that Diane and her siblings grew up in a household where both parents were absent most of the time, but the structure of that absence was completely different from abandonment. They were absent because they were working. They were absent because they had decided that their children's future was more important than their own comfort. And that decision, that particular architecture of sacrifice, shaped everything about how Diane understood the world and her place in it. Diane's mother used to do something that Diane did not fully understand until she was much older. She would pack Diane's lunch for school, and she would put extra food in it, extra sandwiches, extra fruit, extra everything. And Diane would come home, and her mother would not have eaten lunch, just a cup of coffee, just water, just the particular kind of quiet that comes when someone is hungry but does not want anyone to know it. Diane was 11 years old before she fully understood what was happening. She was sitting at the kitchen table, and her mother was making lunch, and Diane saw her mother set aside less food for herself than she was setting aside for her children, and she understood, in a moment that would change how she saw everything forever, that her mother was going without so that she could have more. Not dramatically, not in a way that made a spectacle of itself, just quietly, with the kind of dignity that says this is not a gift, this is just what mothers do. It is what love looks like when it is taken seriously. That revelation, that understanding that the food in her belly had come at the cost of her mother's empty stomach, is what would drive everything Diane Carter did for the next 60 years of her life. Not guilt exactly, not obligation in a simple sense, but the understanding that some debts are paid not once, but continuously, and that the correct way to pay them is not to make a spectacle of it, but to do it quietly, consistently, and without expecting recognition. Diane was the first person in her family to attend a 4-year university. She earned a full scholarship to Spelman College in Atlanta, one of the most prestigious, historically black colleges in the United States, and when she arrived on that campus in the fall of 1982, she was not thinking about her own future. She was thinking about the debt she owed to her parents. She was thinking about the fact that her mother had not eaten lunch so she could have lunch money. She was thinking about the fact that her father had worked extra hours so she could have a quiet place to study. She had arrived at Spelman with one suitcase, $140 in cash that her parents had somehow gathered together, and an understanding of what it had cost them for her to be standing there. Diane did not waste a single day of her college education. She treated it like what it was, not an opportunity, but a responsibility. She graduated in 1986 with a degree in economics and a ferocity of focus that her professors still talked about decades later. She was not trying to be the best student in her class for her own achievement. She was trying to be the best student because she understood that every single moment of her education was being paid for by people who had less than she did. She went straight into the workforce after graduation. She took a position at a real estate investment firm in Atlanta, and she spent the next 15 years learning everything she could about how wealth was built, moved, protected, and sometimes extracted from communities that did not have the tools to protect themselves from that extraction. She learned how to read balance sheets. She learned how to understand zoning laws and property values, and the way that money could be moved in circles that always ended up concentrating more of it in the hands of the people who already had the most. And she watched, during those 15 years, how the neighborhoods that looked like the one she had grown up in were slowly being drained of their residents, their vitality, their future. By the time she was 35 years old, Diane Carter had learned enough to start seeing the system clearly, to understand not just how it worked, but why it worked the way it did, and who benefited from its continued operation. And she made a decision. She left the investment firm. She started her own company. It was called Carter Properties and Development, and its stated mission was something that made her colleagues in the broader business community either laugh or worry, depending on what they thought their money was actually for. The mission was this: to acquire properties in historically disinvested communities and develop them in ways that would strengthen those communities rather than extract from them, that would create wealth for the people who already live there rather than displace them in the name of progress. This was not a popular idea in the world of real estate development. Real estate development is, in its bones, an extractive industry. You find a neighborhood where property is cheap because the people living there do not have power. You buy the property. You improve it. You sell it to people with more money than the original residents have. The original residents leave because they can no longer afford to live there. The property values keep going up, and the people who got in early make enormous amounts of money. It is elegant, efficient, and it has displaced millions of people from their homes. Diane Carter decided to build a business that did the opposite. She spent 15 years building that business. She was not trying to make herself rich. She was already rich by that point. Her early investments and her salary had given her wealth that was more than sufficient. What she was trying to do was figure out a way to use wealth in a way that honored the debt she owed to her parents, to her grandparents, to all the people who had gone without, so that she could have more. She started in Macon, Georgia, where she was born. She identified neighborhoods that were being left behind, that were losing population, that were struggling under the weight of disinvestment and extracted resources. She bought properties carefully, thoughtfully, with the input and consent of the people who already lived there. She developed those properties in partnership with community organizations, with the residents themselves, with people who understood the neighborhoods from the inside rather than from a developer's spreadsheet. And slowly, carefully, almost invisibly, she began to prove that you could make money on real estate development while also strengthening the community you were developing in. You did not have to choose between profit and ethics. You just had to be willing to make less than the maximum possible profit. You just had to be willing to accept good returns instead of spectacular returns. And you had to be willing to do this work without fanfare, without expecting recognition, without building your own name bigger and bigger. By the time Diane was 50 years old, her company had developed more than 300 units of affordable housing across Georgia. By the time she was 55, that number had grown to more than 700 units. By the time she was 61, Diane Carter's company had, in partnership with community organizations and local governments, created or preserved more than 1,500 units of affordable housing, launched more than 80 small businesses in neighborhoods that had been written off as economically dead, and quietly routed hundreds of millions of dollars into communities in ways that strengthened them, rather than depleted them. And she had done almost all of this without any fanfare whatsoever. She did not give interviews. She did not write op-eds about her vision. She did not appear at conferences or TED Talks or any of the other platforms where wealthy people sometimes perform their generosity in ways that center themselves. She just did the work. She just showed up. She just kept the rule that had been with her since her first $1 million. Eat where regular people eat. Remember where you came from. Never forget that the distance between your present and your past is shorter than it looks. But there was something else that Diane carried with her that was not about business or strategy or the architecture of real estate development. There was something older. There was someone. Her grandmother's name was Estelle. Estelle had lived in Macon, Georgia her whole life. She had worked as a seamstress, and she had made clothes for the women in her community, dresses for church, clothes for special occasions, practical everyday clothes that she would repair and adjust as people's bodies changed and their circumstances shifted. Estelle had not had much money. She had had what she made from her sewing, and she had stretched that money across the needs of her family with the kind of precision and care that poor women develop when they have to. When Diane was growing up, Estelle would sometimes give her small amounts of money for school, for expenses that her parents did not have the resources to cover. Nothing dramatic. A few dollars. Enough to make a difference. And Diane, as she got older, began to notice something. Estelle was always thin. Not fashionably thin. Thin in the way that people are thin when they are not getting enough food. Diane was 28 years old, already a successful businesswoman, already making real money, when her mother finally told her the truth about Estelle. When Diane was growing up, when Estelle was giving her money for school, Estelle was skipping meals to do it. Deliberately skipping meals so she could give Diane what Diane needed. Not asking for recognition. Not expecting anything in return. Just doing it the way that love does, quietly and without calculation. Estelle died when Diane was 32 years old. By that point, Diane had already made her first $1 million. She had been planning to drive to Macon to show Estelle what she had accomplished, to say thank you for the meals that Estelle had skipped, to begin to pay back the debt that she understood she owed. But she did not get the chance. She got the call that Estelle had died, and she drove to Macon for the funeral instead of for the celebration. She arrived to find Estelle's house being prepared for the wake, and she went into Estelle's bedroom, and she found something that would change her life completely. She found a series of notebooks, Estelle's household accounts, written in pencil in handwriting that was careful and deliberate, page after page of expenses. And Diane, sitting on Estelle's bed, saw the entries, month after month, year after year, where Estelle had reduced her own food budget to almost nothing, sometimes to $3 a day, and reallocated that money to Diane's school expenses, her mother's school expenses, her siblings' expenses, all recorded with meticulous care. No explanation, no note asking for anything, just the numbers, honest, clear, permanent as the love that created them. Diane sat in that room for 3 hours. She did not leave. She read every single entry. She understood, with a clarity that does not often come to people, that Estelle had been hungry so that other people would not have to be. That Estelle had understood something about what love actually means, that it is not emotional, it is not transactional, it is not about being thanked or remembered. Love is about making sure that the people you care about have what they need, and you do that even if it costs you. You do that especially if it costs you, because that is how you prove that their future is more important to you than your present. That is how you honor the fact that you brought them into a world that is sometimes cruel and sometimes unfair. You go without so they don't have to. From that day forward, Diane understood that everything she did with money was going to be, in some sense, a conversation with Estelle, not in a mystical way, not in a way that would make sense to people who had not experienced it, but in a clear, practical way. She had been given something that she had not earned. She had been given food that cost Estelle her own hunger. She had been given opportunities that cost her parents their time and their comfort. And the only appropriate response to that gift was to spend the rest of her life trying to give similar gifts to people she would never meet, in communities she might never visit, in ways that did not expect recognition or gratitude. She was going to spend the rest of her life being, for other people, what Estelle had been for her, an invisible source of possibility, a quiet yes when most people were saying no, a reminder that someone, somewhere, was not willing to let you fall. This is what Diane Carter was thinking about on the last Tuesday in March when she was sitting alone at a table in a mid-range restaurant in Midtown Atlanta, half-eaten salmon in front of her, carrying 61 years of gratitude and 30 years of trying to pay it forward. She was thinking about Estelle. She was thinking about the notebooks. She was thinking about the meals she had never gotten to buy her grandmother back. She was sitting with that thought, that particular kind of grief that does not go away but just settles into a different part of you, when a young waiter in a white button-down shirt approached her table. It was 9:47 in the evening. The restaurant was winding down. Marcus Webb had been working since 6 a.m. He had done a full lunch shift, then gone home for a few hours, then come back for the dinner shift. This was not unusual for Marcus. This was what his Tuesday looked like. This was what most of his days looked like. Work, come home, check on Ruby, make sure she had eaten something, work again. Come home late, sleep, wake up, work again. He was good at this rhythm. He had adapted to it in the way that young people do when they do not have a choice, by accepting it completely and stopping asking whether it was fair, whether it was what he wanted, whether he was going to be able to do this indefinitely, or whether one day the weight of it was just going to flatten him. He did not ask these questions anymore. He just worked. Ruby was 65 and her health was still declining. His younger sister was in high school and needed things that cost money. The math was simple. There was no room in that math for his own future. He approached table 7, near the window, at 9:47. It was one of the last tables left in the restaurant. Most tables had cleared by 9:30. The kitchen was winding down. The host's stand was already preparing for closing. Marcus was on Autopilot at this point in the evening. He had the movements of clearing a table, down to a precise science. Approach from the right side. Ask if everything was satisfactory. Take the plate. Take the glass. Leave the check. Move on. This was the rhythm. He picked up the plate. It had half a salmon on it, some roasted vegetables, maybe a quarter of what had been served. The woman at the table, he had served her when she arrived, but had not paid particular attention to her, just as she had not paid particular attention to him, had barely eaten. This was not unusual. The restaurant served people from all kinds of situations. Some people came to eat. Some people came for reasons that had nothing to do with food. Some people came to be alone in a room full of other people. Some people came because they needed to sit down and think, and a restaurant was cheaper than a hotel room, and less shameful than a park bench. Marcus took the plate. He turned to walk to the kitchen, and then he stopped. He stood there for a moment that was probably only 5 seconds long, but that felt much longer than that. The kind of moment where you can feel yourself making a decision before you actually make it, where you can feel the before and after of your own life creating themselves around a choice that you have not yet fully articulated. He turned back. He set the plate down on the table. He looked at the woman sitting across from him. She looked up, and he said, quietly, with a directness that surprised even himself, with a voice that was not begging and not apologetic, but just asking, "Ma'am, I'm sorry to ask you this, but can I take these leftovers?" Diane Carter did not answer immediately. She looked at the young man standing at her table, really looked at him, not in the way that a customer looks at a waiter, that half-distracted, slightly impatient glance that is really just looking through someone rather than at them. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at people over 61 years of paying careful attention to the world, fully, directly, with the kind of curiosity that does not make assumptions before it has information. She saw the tiredness around his eyes, the particular tiredness that comes not from one long day, but from a long series of days, each one requiring more energy than the body actually has available. She saw the way he was holding himself, straight, dignified, not apologetic, but not aggressive either, just honest. Just a person asking a question that had something real behind it, not performing need for her entertainment or her charity, just needing something and having the particular courage that it takes to ask for it directly. Diane asked him one word back. She said, "Why?" And Marcus told her. He did not dress it up. He did not perform humility or try to make himself seem more sympathetic than he was. He did not tell a story that was designed to manipulate her into feeling sorry for him. He told her simply and directly that his grandmother had not eaten since that morning. He told her that he had been on shift since 6 a.m. and had not had time to cook anything before coming in. He told her that the leftovers were still warm, which was important, because his grandmother had an issue with eating cold food, something in her digestion that made it difficult. He told her that he did not want the food to go to waste when someone he loved was at home hungry. He did not ask for anything else. He did not imply anything else. He asked for salmon and roasted vegetables because his grandmother was hungry. That was the whole of it. That was the complete architecture of what he needed and why. No performance. No apology. Just a person saying out loud what was true. The restaurant at that hour had maybe 4 other people in it. 2 of them a couple near the bar, occupied with each other. 2 of them a pair of women, finishing dessert by the window, not paying attention to anything except the conversation between themselves. None of them were watching table 7. None of them saw the thing that happened in Diane Carter's face in the 3 seconds after Marcus finished speaking. But it happened. Something moved across her expression. That was not pity and was not sympathy in the ordinary sense of the word. It was something older than that. Something that lived in the part of her where Estelle's notebook entries still lived, where 30 years of trying to pay back an unpayable debt still lived. She recognized something in what Marcus had just said. Not the words of it, but the architecture of it. The structure of a person who would go without so that someone they loved would not have to. She knew that structure intimately. She had been built by people who had that structure. She had tried to build her entire life in response to it. She did not reach for her purse. She did not offer him money in the way that wealthy people sometimes do. As if the gift of money is the primary thing, as if the most important part of helping someone is being able to demonstrate that you have the resources to help them. She did the thing that turned out to matter most. She asked him to sit down. She looked at him directly and said, "What is your name?" He told her Marcus. She said, "Marcus, I want you to sit down." He hesitated. She said, "Please." So he sat. She called over the other waiter on duty, the host, actually, who was helping to close, and she asked him to have the kitchen put together 2 full to-go meals. One for a woman at home who hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. One for the young man sitting at her table who hadn't eaten all day either. She said she would pay for the meals, she would pay the bill, she would take care of everything. But she was not going to let a young man who had been on his feet for 11 hours go home hungry while carrying food to someone else. Marcus started to decline. He said something about not wanting to trouble her, about the kitchen probably being mostly closed, about it not matching. He would be fine. Diane looked at him steadily and said something that he would remember for the rest of his life. She said, "You fed her for 11 hours today. Let someone feed you. That is how this works. That is what people do for each other." And Marcus, tired, 24 years old, carrying more than he should have been, carrying alone, not having been taken care of by an adult in a very long time, sat down. The other staff member went to the kitchen and somehow convinced the cooks, who were already winding down, to put together 2 full, beautiful to-go meals. Not leftovers. Fresh, well-made food. Because that is what dignity looks like sometimes. It looks like insisting that someone else eat the same quality of food that you would eat, not just what is convenient or available. It looks like saying that they are worth that much, at least. That much they deserve. What happened over the next 45 minutes at that table is the kind of thing that does not happen often in adult life. The kind of conversation that cuts straight through all the protective layers that people spend years carefully constructing and gets to the actual person underneath. It started with Diane asking Marcus one question about his grandmother, and then another, and then another. She asked him how old Ruby was. She asked him how long his grandmother had been raising him. She asked him what Ruby liked to eat, what she was good at, what made her laugh. And before either of them had fully intended it, they were talking, really talking, about the things that mattered. Marcus told her about Ruby. He told her about growing up in Southwest Atlanta in a neighborhood that felt safe from the inside, in the way that communities can feel safe when you know everyone and everyone knows you. But that was also economically isolated in ways he was starting to understand now that he had seen other parts of the city. He told her about his mother, or what he could remember of her. He told her about the scholarship. He told her about dropping out to come home. He told her about the bookmarked re-enrollment page on his phone that he checked every few days even, though he already knew what it would say. He told her about Georgia State and the business degree program that he was still officially enrolled in, but that he was no longer attending. He told her about the number for $1,000. That was what was between him and re-enrollment. For $1,000 for fees, books, living expenses for the semester. It seemed like an impossible number. It also seemed like a number that existed in the world, that could theoretically be acquired, if he could just figure out how to earn it faster. He was saving as aggressively as he could. He had a savings account at a credit union. He had money in a jar under his bed because he did not trust banks completely. He was close. He was always close. And then something would happen. The car would need a repair. Ruby would have a medical bill. His sister would need something for school. And the number would keep the same distance from him, always reachable and always out of reach. He told her these things not as a list of grievances, but as a map of where he was, and how he had gotten there, and where he was trying to go. Honest, clear, and without a trace of self-pity. He was not performing victimhood for her. Sympathy. He was not asking her to fix his life. He was just answering her questions, truthfully. And as he talked, something shifted in how he experienced his own story. It was not a dramatic shift. It was subtle, but it was real. It was the shift that happens when you speak your truth to someone who is actually listening, who is not waiting for their turn to talk, who is not thinking about what advice to give you. You speak and you are heard. And being heard, actually heard, is a kind of relief that people do not talk about enough, and Then Diane told him something she had not told a stranger in over 20 years. She told him about Estelle. She told him the basic facts first, her grandmother, her name, her work as a seamstress. And then she told him the harder part. She told him about understanding, as a young woman, that her grandmother had been hungry so she could be full, not just once, year after year. And then she told him about finding the notebooks, about sitting on Estelle's bed after the funeral, reading the meticulous accounts of sacrifice, about understanding that Estelle had gone without food deliberately, systematically, so that other people would not have to. She told him about the specific terror of arriving at her first $1 million and realizing that she would never get to thank Estelle for that she would never get to say, "Your hunger paid for my everything, and I am grateful, and I am going to spend my whole life trying to do the same thing you did. I am going to try to be, for other people, what you were for me." Marcus did not say anything for a moment after she finished. The restaurant was completely quiet now. The other staff members had finished their closing tasks and had stepped outside or into the back. There were just the two of them at the table, and the light, and the weight of what they had both just shared. Then, Marcus said something that made Diane cry. He said, "She sounds like my grandmother." And Diane nodded slowly and said, "I know. I think that is why I stopped when you asked." She reached into her bag. She pulled out a business card. It was plain, simple, no fancy logo, no title, just a name and a phone number. Diane Carter. A phone number. She slid it across the table and told him to call her office on Monday morning. She told him it was not charity. She told him she had a project she had been working on for 2 years that had stalled because she was missing one critical thing. She was missing a person who understood a particular community from the inside out, not from a spreadsheet, not from a consultant's report, but from having lived there, from having grown up on those streets, from understanding what people actually needed versus what outsiders thought they should needs. She told him that if he was as sharp as he seemed, if he was as honest as he had been in the last 45 minutes, she might have a use for his time. And then, she said something that Marcus would repeat to people for the rest of his life. She said, "The difference between opportunity and luck is whether you were ready. When it showed up, be ready." She left the restaurant without waiting for him to respond. She left a cash payment for the bill. She left a tip, $140. Marcus would not know this until much later, but that number was deliberate. $140 was exactly the amount that Diane had in her pocket when she arrived at Spelman College in 1982. It was the amount her parents had somehow gathered together for her. It was the amount she carried forward in her consciousness as a symbol of everything they had sacrificed. She left that same amount every time she ate at a restaurant where she felt the staff deserved more than the standard calculation. It was her way of saying thank you for their labor. It was her way of acknowledging that they were doing harder work than she was doing, that they deserved to be blessed as much as she had been blessed. Marcus did not realize any of this when she left. He just sat at the table and looked at the business card and replayed the conversation in his head. He looked at the to-go boxes that the kitchen had prepared. He looked around the empty restaurant. He felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not hope exactly, but the thing that comes just before hope. The feeling that something is about to shift. The feeling that the story you thought you knew about your own life might actually be more complicated than you realized. He almost did not call. He spent the entire weekend cycling between certainty and doubt in the way that young people do when an adult world briefly opens a door that they are not sure they are qualified to walk through. He told Ruby about the conversation. He did not tell her the specifics at first because he was not sure what they meant. But Ruby, who had spent 65 years reading people accurately, pressed him for details. And when he told her what had happened, what had been said, Ruby listened to the whole thing. And then she said, "Baby, when a door opens, you don't stand outside it deciding whether you deserve to go in. You go in and you prove it once you're there." Marcus called on Monday morning at 9 a.m. She told him that if he was as sharp as he seemed, if he was as honest as he had been in the last 45 minutes, she might have a use for his time. And then, she said something that Marcus would repeat to people for the rest of his life. She said, "The difference between opportunity and luck is whether you were ready. When it showed up, be ready." She left the restaurant without waiting for him to respond. She left a cash payment for the bill. She left a tip, $140. Marcus would not know this until much later, but that number was deliberate. $140 was exactly the amount that Diane had in her pocket when she arrived at Spelman College in 1982. It was the amount her parents had somehow gathered together for her. It was the amount she carried forward in her consciousness as a symbol of everything they had sacrificed. She left that same amount every time she ate at a restaurant where she felt the staff deserved more than the standard calculation. It was her way of saying thank you for their labor. It was her way of acknowledging that they were doing harder work than she was doing, that they deserved to be blessed as much as she had been blessed. Marcus did not realize any of this when she left. He just sat at the table and looked at the business card and replayed the conversation in his head. He looked at the to-go boxes that the kitchen had prepared. He looked around the empty restaurant. He felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not hope exactly, but the thing that comes just before hope. The feeling that something is about to shift. The feeling that the story you thought you knew about your own life might actually be more complicated than you realized. He almost did not call. He spent the entire weekend cycling between certainty and doubt in the way that young people do when an adult world briefly opens a door that they are not sure they are qualified to walk through. He told Ruby about the conversation. He did not tell her the specifics at first because he was not sure what they meant. But Ruby, who had spent 65 years reading people accurately, pressed him for details. And when he told her what had happened, what had been said, Ruby listened to the whole thing. And then she said, "Baby, when a door opens, you don't stand outside it deciding whether you deserve to go in. You go in and you prove it once you're there." Marcus called on Monday morning at 9 a.m. What he found when he walked into Diane Carter's office on that Monday morning changed the entire shape of what he thought his life was going to look like. He had been expecting a job offer, maybe a reference letter, maybe a polite conversation that led nowhere, the kind of conversation that wealthy people sometimes have with young people they feel temporarily charitable toward. What he found instead was a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Atlanta, and sitting at a long table were two people, Diane Carter and another woman, younger, probably in her 40s, who introduced herself as James, and who was apparently Diane's project director. And on the conference table in front of them was a file folder. Inside that file folder was everything that Diane had been building for 2 years in relative silence. The folder contained architectural plans. It contained community development projections. It contained detailed financial models showing how the project would be funded, how the money would move, where the resources were going to come from, and where they were going to go. It contained government approval documents. It contained letters from community organizations expressing their support for the project. It contained detailed maps of the target neighborhood, Marcus's neighborhood, overlaid with demographic data, economic data, social data. All of it pointing to the same fact. This neighborhood had been systematically disinvested in for 40 years. The housing stock was aging. The commercial corridors had been abandoned by businesses that had moved to places with more favorable tax incentives and wealthier customer bases. The young people were leaving because there were no jobs for them to stay for. The old people were staying because they had nowhere else to go, and the cost of living was the only thing that made sense in a neighborhood on the margins. The neighborhood was beautiful. It had character. It had community. It was being slowly strangled by market forces that nobody seemed interested in stopping. And Diane Carter had decided to do something about it. The project was called the Southwest Atlanta Community Development Initiative. The primary goal was to create 200 units of mixed-income, affordable housing in the neighborhood. Not luxury housing. Not the kind of housing that would attract new residents and push out the old ones. Housing that would be affordable to people making 50 to 80% of the area median income. People like Ruby. People like Marcus. People who worked, who paid taxes, who had roots in the neighborhood and no desire to leave. Along with the housing, the project included a commercial component, a small business incubator with 40 units of below-market commercial space, affordable rent, access to capital, mentorship from experienced business people, classes in business management, accounting, marketing. the whole ecosystem that a small business needs to survive. The project had city approval. It had financing. It had everything it needed to break ground. Everything except one thing. The community liaison position had been vacated 3 months earlier when the previous coordinator had left for a position in another city. The liaison's job was not administrative. It was not a desk job that could be filled by anyone with the right credentials. It was the job of being the living, breathing, trusted human face of the project inside the community it was supposed to serve, attending neighborhood meetings, building relationships with residents, understanding what the community actually needed rather than what outsiders assumed it needed, making sure that the people whose streets and blocks would be most affected by the project were heard, included, and protected. Throughout the entire process, Diane had interviewed several people for the position. There was a woman with a master's degree in urban planning who had all the academic credentials and none of the understanding. There was a man who had grown up in Southwest Atlanta 15 years ago but who had left and built a life elsewhere and who came back to the neighborhood the way people sometimes come back to things, nostalgically, from the outside, unable to find the thread of genuine connection. There was a consulting company that offered to provide a liaison service for a significant fee. None of them were right. Diane knew it immediately with each one. Not because they were not qualified on paper. Not because they didn't have the intelligence or the education or the professional experience. But because they didn't have the thing that cannot be taught. They did not have the understanding that only comes from having lived it. From having grown up on those streets. From having ridden those buses and eaten at those corner stores and sat on those porches and known the particular dignity of those communities from the inside. From understanding what it felt like to have people come into your neighborhood and speak about its future in language that did not include you. From understanding what it meant to be the one who could stand between that language and the people it affected and translate, not soften, not dilute, but translate. Make it honest on both sides. Marcus Webb had all of that. He had grown up on those streets. He knew the people. They knew him. They trusted him, not because he had convinced them to trust him, but because he had earned their trust by being honest, by showing up, by being present in the neighborhood, even when he was exhausted, even when he had every reason to leave and build a life somewhere else. If anyone could serve as the bridge between Diane's vision and the neighborhood's needs, it was Marcus. Diane offered him the position. She told him the salary. It was enough to cover his re-enrollment at Georgia State, enough to support his family with actual room to breathe. He would not have to work double shifts. He would not have to be constantly exhausted. He would have the space to think, to plan, to build something real. She told him the condition. He would enroll part-time at Georgia State simultaneously and finish his business degree. She said, "I am not doing this so you can work for me. I am doing this so you can work for yourself. Eventually, I am doing this so you have options." She told him the job was going to be hard. She told him he was going to feel out of his depth regularly. She told him the correct response to that feeling was not to hide it, not to pretend to know something he didn't know, but to bring it to her directly, and they would work through it together. She told him she did not need someone who knew everything. She needed someone who understood what mattered. Marcus sat across from her in that conference room and looked at the file folder, and then looked at the maps, and then looked at her and said something that made the room go quiet. He said, "The block in section 4 of the development plan. That is my grandmother's street." Diane looked at the map. She did not even have to check. She already knew. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I know." Marcus said, "How did you know?" Diane said, "Because I have been protecting that street for a long time." Marcus did not understand what she meant. Not at first. It took him several weeks to understand. It took him going through the financial records of the project, trying to trace the sources of funding, understanding the structure of Diane's work, to slowly piece together what she was telling him. The project itself was only 2 years old, but the roots of the project went much deeper. Diane had been acquiring properties in Southwest Atlanta gradually, carefully, for the past 15 years. She had been researching neighborhoods. She had been working with community organizations. She had been funding things quietly, supporting a community center, helping to keep a library branch open when the city wanted to close it, working with a local youth organization to provide after-school programming. All of it invisible, all of it designed not to draw attention to itself, but just to strengthen the foundation of the neighborhood from the inside out. Before all of that, there was something else, something that Marcus would eventually discover, though Diane never explicitly told him: the anonymous Christmas food distributions that had been arriving on Southwest Atlanta blocks. For 15 years, Diane's organization had been sending them, the small, anonymous grant that had kept Marcus's elementary school library funded and open. For 3 years when the city had tried to cut its budget in 2008. That had come through one of Diane's foundations, the neighborhood park renovation 2 streets. From Ruby's house that had appeared one summer with new equipment and new benches, and a community garden plot, Diane's money, Diane's planning, Diane's deliberate investment in a neighborhood she had never personally visited but that she had researched with the same precision and depth that she researched everything. She had not known Marcus Webb, but she had been, for 15 years, a quiet architect of the conditions that had allowed his family to survive with dignity in a neighborhood that the market had long since decided was not worth preserving. She had been working in the dark, on a long timeline, in the way that only people with real conviction and real resources can work, not for visibility, not for recognition, but because the work itself was the point. Because Estelle's notebooks were the point. Because every dollar she had ever made was, in some meaningful sense, a multiplication of what her grandmother had gone without, and she intended to honor that fully and completely, and without fanfare for as long as she lived. When Marcus found out the full scope of it, he sat in his car outside Ruby's house. It was the same parking spot where he used to sit on the late nights after his double shifts, feeling the weight of things, trying to gather the energy to walk into the house and face another day of responsibilities. But this time he was not feeling the weight. This time he felt something different. He felt seen. He felt held. He felt like for all the years he thought he was carrying things alone, there had actually been someone working in the background, in the darkness, making sure the foundation beneath him held, making sure his neighborhood did not fall apart completely, making sure his grandmother did not fall through the cracks. Not because she knew him, not because she had any obligation to him, but because she understood something about love, and she had decided to dedicate her life to expressing that love in the direction of people she would never meet. He called Diane from that car. It was late. She answered. She knew it was him, without him saying who he was. She said, "You figured it out." He said, "When did you know? When did you know about my neighborhood?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I grew up 2 blocks from where your grandmother lives." Marcus said nothing. There was nothing to say. Some revelations are too large for immediate language. You have to let them settle into the body before the mind can process them. 2 blocks. That was the distance. For 61 years, those 2 blocks had been an uncrossable distance of time and circumstance and the random cruelty of a country that decided some people's wealth was worth protecting and some people's wealth was worth extracting. And then, one Tuesday night, in a restaurant in Midtown Atlanta, a young man asked a simple question about a to-go box, and those 2 blocks became nothing at all. Diane told him more, over subsequent calls and conversations. She told him that she had been born in her grandmother's neighborhood, not exactly on Ruby's block, but close enough to see it from her own house. She had lived there until she was 4 years old, when her family moved to Macon. She had not thought about that neighborhood for decades. But when she was developing her first community development projects, when she was researching neighborhoods in Georgia where disinvestment was most severe, where the market had most thoroughly abandoned the people living there, her hometown came up again and again in the data. She pulled the census information. She saw the population decline. She saw the property abandonment. She saw the economic extraction. And she recognized it. She recognized it because it was the neighborhood of her childhood. It was the place where she had learned to understand what love looked like when it had to choose between its own comfort and someone else's future. She could not fix the past. She could not go back and make it so that her own family had had more, or that Estelle had never been hungry. But she could try to protect the place that had made her who she was. She could try to ensure that Future generations of children growing up in that neighborhood would have what she did not have: stability, resources, the sense that they were not being abandoned by the broader world. She could try to do what Estelle had done, what Ruby had done, what every person who truly loves someone does. She could go without herself so that other people would not have to. She could build systems that would hold them. She could send food at Christmas. She could fund libraries. She could protect parks. She could, eventually, transform entire blocks in ways that did not displace the people who already lived there, but that honored them and supported them and gave them a chance. And she had been doing this work for 15 years without ever expecting to meet the people she was helping. She had been doing this work in the dark until Marcus asked about leftovers, until a simple question about salmon opened a door that neither of them had known was there. Marcus went to see Ruby that night. He sat down in her kitchen where he had sat so many times, at the table where she had made him countless meals, where she had helped him with homework, where she had listened to him talk about school and dreams and fears. And he told her what he had discovered. He told her that Diane Carter had grown up 2 blocks away. He told her about the work that Diane had been doing quietly in the neighborhood for 15 years. He told her that the food boxes that had arrived every Christmas, the ones that Ruby had always accepted with gratitude but without asking too many questions, those had been from Diane. They had been from someone who understood what it meant to go without. Someone who had made a choice to spend her wealth in a way that honored her own grandmother's sacrifice by extending that same kind of sacrifice to strangers. Ruby listened. Ruby cried. Ruby understood in a way that younger people sometimes cannot, that this was not about charity. This was not about pity or guilt or the kind of helping that makes the helper feel better about themselves. This was about love. This was about one woman understanding that her life had been made possible by another woman's hunger and deciding that she could not live with herself unless she spent her life trying to reverse that equation for other people. This was about legacy. This was about the particular American story of people at the bottom of the hierarchy understanding something about what it takes to survive and to help others survive. And then, when those people got power, those people remembering what it felt like to be at the bottom and choosing to use that power in ways that honored that memory. Marcus Webb enrolled at Georgia State University the following semester. He graduated 14 months later with his business degree. He walked across that stage on a Saturday morning in May while Ruby sat in the second row in a white dress she had bought specifically for that day, crying the same tears she had been saving for years. The photograph from that morning, Ruby in her white dress, Marcus in his cap and gown, her hands on his face, was not posted on social media. It was not used as a marketing image or a symbol of triumph. It was framed and placed on the mantle in Ruby's living room in Southwest Atlanta, next to a photograph of Marcus's mother. It stayed there. The Southwest Atlanta Community Development Project broke ground 8 months after Marcus joined the team. 200 units of affordable housing, 40 small business spaces, a community gathering room that the neighborhood had specifically requested during the listening sessions Marcus had led over the previous 6 months. At the groundbreaking ceremony, politicians spoke. Community leaders spoke. Diane's project director, James, spoke. Diane herself stood in the back row of the assembled crowd, under a plain umbrella, in clothes that gave no indication of who she was to anyone who did not already know. She did not speak. She did not want to. The event was not for her. The event was for the community. It was for the people who had been waiting, who had been patient, who had been holding on to hope in a neighborhood that the broader world had written off as a loss. Ruby Webb attended the groundbreaking. Marcus had arranged a car to bring her from the house. She sat in the front row in a folding chair with a program in her lap. She was 76 years old now. Her hair had turned completely white, but her eyes were the same eyes that had watched over Marcus since he was 6 years old. Clear, sharp, taking in everything. When the ceremonial shovels broke the earth, she applauded quietly. She looked around at the neighborhood she had lived in for 40 years. She said, to no one in particular, "It is about time." She did not know the full story. She did not know about the 15 years of quiet investment, the research, the protection, the deliberate choices made in the darkness. She just knew that something good was happening in her neighborhood, and that her grandson was standing up there in a hard hat with his name on it, and that was enough. Over the next year, Marcus worked on the project with a dedication that surprised even Diane, who had believed in him from the beginning. He attended every community meeting. He listened to every resident who wanted to talk. He heard their concerns about displacement, about the possibility that the project was a Trojan horse that would eventually lead to gentrification and the loss of their neighborhood to people from outside. He addressed those concerns directly. He did not dismiss them. He did not ask people to trust him just because he had grown up in the neighborhood. He earned their trust by being transparent, by being honest about what would and would not happen, by insisting on provisions in the legal documents that would protect long-term residents from being priced out of their own neighborhood. He worked with local organizations to set up community land trusts that would hold some of the land in perpetuity, ensuring that future generations would be able to afford to live there. He worked with small business owners who wanted to set up shops in the new commercial space. He helped them think through their business plans. He connected them with the resources and mentorship they needed to succeed. He was not just administering a project. He was building something. He was building a future for his neighborhood that looked like his neighborhood, that served the people already living there, that did not require them to leave or to fundamentally change in order to benefit from the development. 1 year after the groundbreaking, Diane called Marcus into her office for the second time. The office looked the same as it had looked a year earlier. The same windows overlooking Atlanta, the same long table, and on that table was another folder. Inside it were incorporation papers. Diane had made Marcus a 15% equity partner in the Community Development LLC, not as a reward for good work, though that was part of it, not as a gesture of generosity, though that was also part of it, but as a structural recognition of what he had built in that community over the previous year, the relationships he had formed, the trust he had earned, the residents who showed up to meetings because Marcus was going to be there, and they knew he was going to tell them the truth. Real partnership, real ownership, not charity, not a gift, an acknowledgement that the value he had created was real and belonged to him. He was not working for Diane anymore. He was working with Diane. They were partners. They were both invested in the future of the neighborhood, both risking their reputations, both committed to seeing it succeed. He asked her why. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You told me something that first night that I have not forgotten. I asked you why you wanted those leftovers, and you said that wasting good food while someone you love is hungry is not something you can make peace with. I have been thinking about that sentence for a year, because it is not just about food. It is about talent. It is about time. It is about potential. Wasting good people while the communities they come from are struggling. That is something I have never been able to make peace with either. You are not a charity case, Marcus. You are exactly what this work is supposed to produce. And it is time your stake in it reflected that." Marcus Webb still works on that project today. He is 26 years old. The Southwest Atlanta development is now in its second phase, with plans to expand into 2 adjacent neighborhoods. He is enrolled in a part-time master's program at Georgia State. He drives a car without a check engine light. Ruby still lives in her house on her street, the same street that is now formally protected from displacement under the community land trust that Marcus helped establish as part of the development framework. That mechanism ensures the people who have always lived there will always be able to afford to stay. Ruby is 76 years old. Now, her health is better. She eats 3 meals a day. She goes to church. She sits on her porch and watches the neighborhood change in ways that serve it rather than extract from it. She watches her grandson build something real. Diane Carter still eats at mid-range restaurants once a month. She still leaves $140 when she feels the staff deserves more than the standard calculation. She still does not want the spotlight. She still answers her phone when Marcus calls, no matter the hour. She has expanded her work to 3 states now. She has developed partnerships with other organizations that share her vision, but she has not changed her fundamental approach. She still works quietly. She still refuses credit. She still measures success not in how many people know her name, but in how many people are able to stay in their neighborhoods, to build their lives, to have the kind of stability that Estelle never had, that Ruby had, to fight for, that Marcus was given as a gift. And the salmon, the half-eaten plate of salmon that started all of this, Marcus had it packed into a to-go box and drove it to Ruby's house that night, along with the full meal the kitchen had prepared. Ruby ate at the kitchen table in her white housecoat and said the salmon was good. She asked Marcus how his night had been. He said it had been interesting. She said, good interesting or bad interesting? He thought about it and said, the kind you do not know the answer to yet. Ruby nodded the way she always nodded when he said something she recognized as true, and she told him to finish his food before it got cold. He did not tell her about Diane that night. He was not ready. Some stories need to settle before you can speak them. He sat at Ruby's kitchen table and ate his meal and looked at his grandmother and thought about what Diane had said about Estelle, about showing up with money too late, about the empty kitchen, about the notebooks. He thought about how the difference between their stories was not about virtue or effort or intelligence. It was about time. It was about arriving at the door before it closed. He thought about all the Marcus Webbs in all the Southwest Atlantas and all the cities in this country who were sitting in their cars in the middle of the night, feeling the weight, carrying it quietly, waiting for a door that nobody was coming to open. He thought about that for a long time. Then he finished his food, washed his dish, kissed his grandmother on the forehead, and went home and set his alarm for the morning. Here is what I want you to sit with. Not the inspiring part, though it is that. Not the coincidence of it, though it is remarkable. I want you to sit with the structure of it. The invisible architecture of sacrifice and love that had to exist for this story to happen. Ruby going without lunch so Marcus could have school money. Estelle going without food so Diane could have bus fare. Diane building a machine out of grief and gratitude that quietly fed and housed and protected communities she had never personally visited. All of it flowing forward, invisible and accumulating, until it landed on one Tuesday night and one simple question about leftovers. How much of what you have been given was paid for by someone who never told you about it? How many meals did someone skip for you that you will never know about? How many quiet sacrifices are embedded in the foundation of your life, unacknowledged, uncelebrated, just present, as permanent, and invisible as the bones in the earth? And here is the harder question. Not about gratitude, though that is part of it. The harder question is about what you do with what you were given. Not the money, not the opportunities, but the actual inheritance, the hunger to make sure that what was paid for your sake does not go to waste. That is what drove Estelle. That is what drove Ruby. That is what drove Diane Carter to eat alone in mid-range restaurants and send anonymous food boxes and protect streets she had never walked. That is what drove Marcus Webb to ask a question that took everything he had to ask. None of them were extraordinary in the way that word usually gets used. They were ordinary people doing the things that love demands when it is taken seriously. So let me ask you this directly, and I want you to answer it in the comments. Because I believe this is the question this story is actually about. Who in your life has gone without, quietly, privately, without asking for recognition, so that you could have more? And what are you doing with what they gave you? Because if you can answer that honestly, really honestly, then you already understand everything this story was trying to say. Before we go deeper into understanding the broader implications of what happened between Marcus and Diane, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because next week, we are bringing you the story of a Black architect from Mississippi who designed one of the most iconic buildings in American history, and whose name was left off every single record for 50 years. That story is coming. Make sure you are here for it. This has been the story of Marcus Webb and Diane Carter, a waiter and a woman who understood the weight of inherited love, a question about leftovers, and 30 years of love paid forward in the dark that found its way home on a Tuesday night in Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you for watching.